Hello everybody and welcome to this customer focused webinar around use case dashboards. I'm Joel Windles and I'm the VP of Inbound Marketing.
And my name's Nick Taylor and I'm the product marketer here at Brandwatch.
Today we're going to be talking about use case dashboards. You might have seen them in the platform already, and typically we run webinars for a wider community, but in this instance we wanted to actually speak to you guys as our users and explain why we built this feature and then show you the 3 examples that we've put in the platform already. So don't be shy, we would love your participation. If you have questions that you'd like to ask me and Nick, or contributions or any other suggestions for us, you can either email Nick directly, or if you'd like to do it in real time as we're talking through the webinar, you can use the hashtag BrandwatchTips. And of course there's a chat box right at the bottom of GoToWebinar, which you can submit your questions to as well. So how does this slide relate to what we're going to talk about? Well, I think all of you guys as Brandwatch users are probably quite familiar with the sense of being overwhelmed when you first come into Brandwatch. So we've built this platform that is designed to be incredibly powerful and sophisticated and do something maybe not quite as complex as Reach Orbit, but we know that it's quite a complex task getting stuff out of Brandwatch. Now, our task as marketers and builders of the product is how can we put the stuff that's most useful in the hands of the people that need to use it? So I sometimes think of Brandwatch as a little bit like Google Analytics. It's incredibly powerful. I remember when I first started using Google Analytics about 4 years ago, I was taught how to do something in a very particular way. And from that point onwards, it was really hard to actually work out how to do anything else. And I relied upon these same 3 or 4 things to get all of the insights and results I needed. And I'm not sure how many of the people listening to this webinar are aware, but Google Analytics has a practically overwhelming number of features and options, and it can eventually do everything. It's just not always immediately obvious how. So we do something at Brandwatch called Funky Friday, which is every other week. Anyone in the company is allowed to work on whatever project they like. So it could be quite far removed from their main job. It could be reading on how to get better at something. But one of these projects was a combination of engineers and marketers getting together to say, well, what can we do to actually help our users get the components that are most useful to them? So when we do customer surveys and things like that, we try to understand what you guys are using the platform to do. So we built this technology that listens and harvests all this data from the web and all of these analytical tools to make use of it. But actually, some of the stories we've heard have shown some really kind of crazy things that you've ended up doing. So some have recovered stolen goods from Gumtree and Craigslist. Some have prevented credit card fraud from sites like Pastebin, and some are even doing sort of cyber security and some really kind of things we just never really thought of when we were building Brandwatch. But even among the kind of mainstream marketing use cases, there are loads. And it was with this in mind that we actually started to put together these use case dashboards. So the first one is centered around PR. So people working in PR want to do a very different thing in Brandwatch than people who are working in customer service, for example. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with PR, but a kind of cornerstone of success in PR has traditionally been the clippings book. So this is where you cut out newspaper and magazines that features your brand and might put it in a shiny big laminated book on a coffee table in reception of your headquarters. But with the advent of the internet and news being dead a matter of hours after it's been first published, we actually find that lots of our clients are using Brandwatch to track the news coverage that they're getting and kind of attribute value to different mentions that they're getting in different publications. So it's with this kind of philosophy that we put together the first dashboard that Nick's going to take you on a live demo through. So if we could just go over to Nick, who will be demonstrating that first one.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. Yes, so I'm going to show you through the PR and news dashboard, and the query that I've chosen is a really great one because there is lots and lots of different news and PR that has happened over the last month. We'd all love to get the PR that Apple does. We might not all get dashboards looking quite this full, but it's very interesting to see that Apple Pay, which launched last month in the UK, is getting a huge amount of news mentions, and the lucky PR manager who is looking at how much attention they've received can look through all of these different stories and start to understand what kind of things are being talked about around their brand, specifically Apple Pay in this instance, and what sort of stories are the newspapers picking up on. It's a nice news clippings board and a great summary for a PR manager. You can also understand a little bit about who the specific authors are at some of these places specifically. The next tab is the news coverage quality, and this is a really important distinction. It's not just about getting lots and lots of news stories, it's about how good the coverage is. And we rank this using MozRank, and MozRank is a sort of a measure of how important a website is. So if you're getting news coverage in some of the top global newspapers, you might get some of these sort of MozRank 7 out of 10, and that's what Apple did on this particular week when the Apple Pay launched. And for each of these different MozRank sections, we can start to sort of click through and find out which papers were those and what were the stories that those really, really top newspapers were talking about. You can also spot in some of these if there is sentiment attached and start to understand whether these stories are positive or negative. Now, it's all very well getting into the press and the newspapers. We won't all do that immediately. And one of the places where stories about your brand really start and where those ideas are shared is in the blogs. And what we define in terms of the blog tab here as a blog is something that isn't really a regular news site. So you'll find all sorts of different websites where people have been talking a lot about Apple Pay in this particular example, such as Tech Radar, Digital Spy, and if you scroll down, even things like hungryhouse.co.uk, who are clearly blogging about Apple Pay because people are going to be able to start buying takeaway food through their websites. I might want to sort of collect a few of these sites and add them to a site list so that I can really kind of collect a list of places where I think I need to start getting my name out there, talking to the bloggers who write those things, and getting more PR. The journalists on Twitter. Now, if the blogs are where the stories really begin, Twitter is where the stories explode. And journalists are all on Twitter, especially in the UK. And the journalists tab will show you some of those people that we've identified as being a journalist based on Twitter. And we're ranking these people by their impact, their total impact. And so this takes into account how often they're talking about you and also how influential they are. So somebody like Matt here has come top because he's talked about Apple Pay a lot. We can have a look at, first of all, his Twitter profile, and we can see he's the man behind Engadget UK. This might be just the kind of slightly smaller influencer, only 10,000 followers. I mean, that is a lot, but it's not millions, it's not hundreds of thousands. And he's just the kind of person who's clearly having a really big impact around this particular launch. And we start to understand what it is that he's been saying, and maybe we can start to engage with somebody like that. If we have a look at the topics, this gives us, I think, a really nice sort of qualitative analysis of what's going on out there really, really quickly. And I just want to sort of talk about something as I'm looking at this tab with you, which is that these are all really a starting point, these use case dashboards, and nobody's going to use them as they are forever. And one of the things that we're really proud of in Brandwatch Analytics is the flexibility and the control that we allow you to have. Now, I've done something in these word clouds, which is a really, really simple thing to do, but really, really effective. I've created some categories. So by categorizing specific things as belonging to another topic, and in this case, different businesses and banks, I can sort all of those comments or mentions that come through relating to those banks and shops into specific categories. And this topic cloud is set up automatically to show me those stories. So in this talked about in news articles word cloud, I can already see as the sort of PR rep for Apple Pay in the UK, which shops are getting mentioned the most during the launch of my new product. I can also do the same thing with what the topics are that the journalists have been talking about on Twitter. And it's a final tab here has a little bit more information about what goes on Twitter, and I can have a look, for example, at who the most mentioned tweeters are in relation to my product or to the topic that I'm tracking, and I can also have a look at some of the top hashtags, so some of the ones here that you would probably expect. some of the top stories in this was really quite interesting, and it's a really good example of why looking at Twitter and what's trending there is another angle on a PR launch. And this story here, this was a story about Barclays originally not supporting Apple Pay, which they then went on to change their stance on that. And those sorts of stories, you can see, have a huge amount of interest on Twitter and lots of people talking about them. So that's the PR and news dashboard. I'll go back to you, Joel.
Thank you, Nick. So yeah, really the thinking behind these is what we believe is most important features to those working in PR. But if you are on this webinar and you're thinking, do you know what, there's a couple of components that I always use in Brandwatch that haven't actually included in this dashboard, please do let us know, because I'd like these things to be actually iterative and change and morph into the ways that you guys are actually using them rather than simply what we think is useful. So anyone who isn't working in PR might be a little bit bored now, so we're going to be moving on to influencers. So again, I mean, this is a huge topic all in itself, and of course people might be aware that we bought an influencer-based company at the end of last year, Peer Index, and the sheer breadth of categories and topics and ways you can go about identifying influencers is overwhelming. But I think one of the most useful things is actually to strip away all the stuff that's not useful and not relevant to influencer marketing. So just a very quick primer on influencer marketing. I'm English, so when I'm at a networking event, I found it incredibly awkward, and I sort of stand around like these guys here looking like a fool. But I think a lot of brands have come to realize that the equivalent of standing on the table with a megaphone and shouting at everyone isn't the best way to get people to do what you want or buy your products. One of the most effective ways, of course, is to find the most influential people in the room, tell them your message, or kind of get them to agree with what you're trying to say, and then they will organically filter it across the room. And of course, that applies in the digital age too. I would suggest that word of mouth and social media and organic marketing is far more effective than a simple and quite expensive advert. So, of course, it's with this in mind that once again we put together a dashboard around influencers. So if anybody is wondering, the way you access these is just the same way you do with any other query. So once you've selected a new dashboard, you'll be presented with this screen, which used to only have default Facebook, Twitter, and demographics. And now you'll start to see some of these new use case orientated dashboards. And all you do is click on them and select which data source you would like to have. So that's exactly what Nick is about to do. And I think he's going to be taking us through an airline in relation to influencer marketing. So again, over to you, Nick, please.
Yes, what I am looking at in terms of influencers is the Glastonbury Festival. And I'm trying to get my data to load. Here it is. So Glastonbury is one of the largest music festivals in the world, and it has become a brand in its own right, but it gets a huge amount of attention from very, very influential people. I'm not sure why my top authors aren't showing, but I will cut straight to the top tweeters. So when we're looking at a list of influencers, there are a few different ways of organizing them by the importance that matters to me. So we talked a little bit in the PR dashboard about that impact score, and that was useful for finding those sort of smaller type of influencers who are really regularly engaging. But what I've decided to look at on this one is the number of followers, and you can see that something like Glastonbury as a brand has some very, very important tweeters talking about it. People in the music industry, obviously. And these kinds of celebrities can have a huge reach. And so a company that is working around a big event like this, or a brand that really does get mentions from celebrities, can discover those kinds of influential conversations and obviously try to make the most of them straight away. But we can also have a look at some people less celebrity focused. We're again looking at the bloggers with these influencers, and looking at blogs is a really, really interesting source of sort of smaller conversations that start to get picked up and move on and get bigger. And we can have a look at all sorts of different blogs talking about music, some talking about charity here, some talking about finance, that are talking about us and talking about this particular event in very, very different ways. Once again, we can create lists of these top sites and start to collect and share those insights about where our brand is being talked about very, very easily using this export button and downloading these kinds of lists immediately. Now, the Key Advocates is a really, really nice tab. So this tab is showing me some slightly less important tweeters and people on other networks. These are people who are really talking about my brand a lot. So some of these people have tweeted really, really regularly about Glastonbury. If we have a look at the top one, this is a really nice example of the kind of influencer that you might not have discovered if you were looking at follower numbers. So this WI Glasto Cakes only has 1,000 followers. However, they've had a really big impact around this particular brand. They talk about Glastonbury a lot. And these sorts of smaller influencers, everyday influencers, are great to compile into large lists, take those through in the workflow to your community managers and take them through to your campaign managers and say, these are the kinds of people we can actually reach out to right now, straight away. You also can have a look at some of the key detractors, the people who've talked most often negatively about our brand. No surprise, One Direction has skewed the data here because people are saying that One Direction has said that they were not cool enough to go to Glastonbury, so there were some negative comments around that. We can also get a very quick overview of some of the demographics of our most influential people in our audience, so the most influential people talking about us. And so the way that we've done that is by saving a filter on here. So if you click on this filters tab, you'll see that everybody in this particular tab has 1,000 followers or more. And we can understand some of the interests that these influential people are interested in and their professions and where they are in the world. Now, this filters tab is a really, really powerful place to start customizing these starting point dashboards. So this is a really great example of when I want to use the filters. I can see actually there was a lot more conversation going on right at the beginning of this month, and that's because it's just before, just after Glastonbury started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the amount of time that I want to have a look at, and then go back through all my tabs to see actually, was there more conversations going on earlier on? Now, once I have saved that filter, and it's taking a while, I think, because there was a lot more mentions on the day that Glastonbury started. But there it is. Now, once I've done that, I can save that dashboard, and when I come back to it, it will have all of that June 25th to July 30th saved for the next person who wants to have a look at it. So that's the influencers dashboard, Joel.
Cool. Thanks very much, Nick. And I think the screen share needs to go back to me. And I think the thing with influencers, which everyone sort of should be aware of, is that influencers can be determined in completely different ways depending on your brand. So some people might say you want your big hitters, your machine guns or rocket launchers, the Justin Biebers that reach millions and millions of people all at once, but probably not that targeted. And then the snipers, the people who probably don't reach quite as many people, but actually are delivering a really razor-sharp message to exactly the right kind of people. So I would very much appreciate your thoughts on influencer marketing, either on the dashboard we've put together or, of course, in ones that you might suggest for yourselves. The last one we'll take you through today is on reputation management. So, I mean, crisis aversion has become a huge topic, certainly in the advent of social, and I know that lots of our customers primarily use Brandwatch for reputation management. Now, reputation is more than just a dashboard with negative sentiment. You might have seen some of our recent products, say Signals came out in March, which is designed to surface things that you might not have noticed, patterns in your data that reveal potential things that could go wrong or could go right even. And we also know that lots of our users are basically tasked with a social NPS. So the ability to actually listen to say, what do people think of our brand? What can we do about it? And once they've done that thing, what do people think of our brand now? And so putting the means of measuring how people perceive your brand in front of marketers and in front of people working in communications and with data was the driving factor behind this. So once again, this is a good place to start. You click on your dashboard, and then I would really recommend taking the components we've put together and customizing it to the specific use case that you want to do. And of course, use them in conjunction with alerts and signals and things like that at the same time. So for the final time, I'm just going to go over to Nick, who's going to share his dashboard, which is about airlines this time. Apologies for the mix-up last time.
This is my reputation dashboard, and it's looking at the reputation of a cheap airline called EasyJet. And airlines, I think, are a really good use case for this because they're the kind of company that do get a lot of negative mentions. And if you ruin somebody's holiday, they are very, very likely to start bad-mouthing you on the internet. However, it's not always a crisis when that happens. So this reputation dashboard is a really interesting place to start having a look at what the reputation is over time, if there are any things that people need to be concerned about, and when something happens that really needs an action to go and prevent a crisis taking place. So we can see, yes, there are a lot of negative comments going around about EasyJet, but it's not really that common to sort of go out and say how wonderful an airline is either. So we can see over time whether there are any specific points at which something's happening that we actually really want to have a look at and look into. So for example, this red negative peak, we might want to say, right, what was going on the 26th of July that went wrong? Now, in the topics section, we can understand a little bit more about what the topics, what the things were that these people were getting disgruntled about. We have the positive topics one to make you feel a little bit better, and people have had a lovely flight, but they've also had delays and probably being sarcastic about them. Now, in the negative topics, we actually get to the heart of what's going on in this reputation dashboard. What things are making people angry about this brand? Now, an EasyJet reputation manager might say, yeah, there's a few things here about delays, there are a few things here about strikes and cancellations. We know that those things upset people. We are always working on that from our customer service team, but we could have a look at one of those topics to see if there was anything in particular over the last month, or of course we could filter it and come to over the last day or week to see if there's something that we could take action about. Now, the reputation manager looking at this particular list of reasons for delays might or might not be happy to see that it wasn't really their fault. It was the fact that Kate Moss got escorted from a flight. Now, the EasyJet got into the press because of that, and so these are very negative comments, but hopefully they're being negative about Kate Moss and not about EasyJet for doing what they did.
I think it's interesting that people are positive about seating and baggage.
Yeah, to be positive. Yeah. What else are people being negative about? Well, we can have a look at some of those key detractors. So we had a look at this briefly in a similar way for the influencers. And again, we're looking at people who've really made the most common negative comments. So the people that are, constantly bad-mouthing your brand. And these might or might not be people that you want to keep an eye on. So for example, someone like GripoFeed, the name is a clue. And what they are doing is they are just retweeting horrible experiences that people have had on EasyJet. So what are they up to? Well, they're obviously trying to spread a bit of bad blood about this brand. This might be exactly the kind of person they want to add to an author list and then keep track of. They might then plug that into one of our alerts or signals and say, if this person gets a lot more mentions, or if this person gets a lot of retweets, or anyone on this list, I really need to know about that straight away. And they'll get an email straight into their inbox, and it will be able to come back to this reputation dashboard and see what has been going on. Negative press, this is working from a slightly higher level, and in the negative press section, you might want to have a click on some of these to see the mentions and see, right, we know that there was a lot of negative things going on, but did the press pick up on any big stories and turn them into something bigger? So Kate Moss did start making the headlines of the big papers. Luckily, that's still that same story. Perhaps that's not something that my EasyJet reputation manager needs to be too concerned about for now. And finally, the last tab on here is another sort of bad news over time, and has that same glimpse of those peaks where lots and lots of news stories have been covered, and we can see, was there something that happened on this specific day that was not good news? And in this case, this might be something that they would want to act on. So there was a story, a very strange story of an Australian musician who put on all of his clothes all at the same time in order to avoid the baggage restrictions on EasyJet. Now, this is a really, really interesting kind of thing kind of story, because this is exactly the kind of stuff that starts trending on the internet. A really stupid story, but which is talking about quite a negative perception of this EasyJet brand and the problem that they have with these baggage restrictions. And this is the sort of thing that a reputation PR manager might want to address and start creating some more positive conversations around that.
Or even turn the story into something more positive.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they let him on for free or something like that.
Quite right.
So that's the end of the dashboard.
That's our end of our dashboard.
All right. Well, thanks.